Hello and welcome to the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato, and today we're going to be talking about China and Russia are targets of the G7 summit, and they draw closer to fend off the West. And so the G7, I don't know how relevant it really is anymore. I mean, countries like Germany are deindustrializing, even their own domestic businesses are looking abroad to uh, diversify their investments, their holdings. You see the United Kingdom really declining. It has a major recession right now. Their people are far poorer than they really should be. The United States has huge homelessness crises. It has drug problems. People can't afford to pay for housing anymore. They can't afford to pay for food anymore, et cetera, et cetera. And so G7 countries seem pretty largely irrelevant. And then other G7 countries like Italy, I don't know why they would even be in competition here because Italy is just not a major economy. In terms of exports, cultural exports is really its primary thing. Tourism, the fact that Italian culture is very dominant in the world in general. But in terms of actual tangible exports, it really doesn't have overly many. And so G7 largely irrelevant, but they're doing their best to force China and Russia into a corner, and unfortunately for them, it's the same corner. So they're back to back, just fighting against the G7, and it's becoming easier and easier over time to fight against the G7 because the G7 is weakening while Russia and China are strengthening. And by the way, this is something that I've known for over a decade now. I've been talking about this since my late teens, my early 20s. I was always like, Russia, China, what are Russia, China doing? Like they're gonna have to team up if they want to succeed here. I mean, the schism between Soviet Union and communist China was one of the biggest detriments to their success that could have happened because you have two great powers right next to each other, and the United States would like nothing more than to pit them against each other, which it did. And they learned that lesson. They learned, and they are making sure that that type of thing does not happen again. Okay, so Western countries backing Ukraine are turning their attention to Asia. So, yeah, they would love to do the same thing to China that they're doing to Russia right now. Russian troops poured into Ukraine over a year ago. Many experts foresaw a strategic windfall for China, with the United States distracted again by a war far from Asia. Okay, so this is that actual first sentence is why I decided to go over this article. So this article is by the New York Times. This sentence, I love this sentence. Can anyone see why the New York Times is not considered a legitimate news source anymore? When Russian troops poured into Ukraine over a year ago, many experts foresaw a strategic windfall for China, with the United States distracted again by a war far from Asia. This war is between Russia and Ukraine. Russia is a country that is majority in Asia. Okay? And they're conducting military operations within Ukraine, which is right next to Asia. So saying that United States is distracted again by war far from Asia, that couldn't be much further from the truth unless both countries were completely within Asia. It's just so weird. And this is the first sentence of an article published in the New York Times. These two people, Pearson and Buckley, okay, I remember looking them up a while ago. One of them is actually supposedly like an Asian expert. But these two people, as well as multiple editors at the New York Times, had to approve of this article. They had to approve, like, oh, yes, Russia, very far from Asia. Have you looked at a globe? Have you looked at a map? Hmm? Hmm? Have you like got out your GPS? Just looked at zoomed out a little bit? Just looked. Russia is majority in Asia. What are you doing? What are you doing, New York Times? Weren't you like the paper of record? Like everyone went to you before, blah, 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 blah. And now you're posting this as your first sentence. Like there was no one that was just like, hey, maybe we should look to see if either of these countries are like majority in Asia before we post this, with the United States distracted again by a war far from Asia. Hmm? Hmm? You okay? You okay? So aside from the New York Times being a joke and completely incompetent, this article also gets into some other stuff related to Beijing being alarmed about the Western Bloc uh, entrenching itself in China's neighborhood after it pivots away from the Ukraine situation. So the leaders of the Group of Seven Nations last week pledged more support for Kiev and angered Beijing by challenging its claim to South China Sea, vowing to resist economic coercion and pressing China on human rights abuses in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, days after Moscow and Beijing are reinforcing their relationship by holding security and trade talks with Prime Minister Mikhail Mushkin of Russia leading a delegation of business tycoons on a visit to China. So this is just kind of hilarious here. So we see challenging its claims in the South China Sea. That has nothing to do with the G7. So they could just mind their own business. Vowing to resist economic coercion. Do you understand, like, the sanctions, this trade war that's going on? This is entirely a Western invention. Like, it's no wonder that gaslighting is such a common term in modern America, because the American government gaslights people so much more than any other government I've ever seen, pressing China on human rights abuses in Xinjiang. So recently, I cannot pronounce that word, by the way. Recently, a delegation of multiple different countries, I think it was at least a dozen different Arabic or Muslim countries, went to Xinjiang, and they said, like, no, this is fine. Everyone's doing good. I mean, they obviously had to crack down on the people who were like going around with machetes and hacking people, chopping people up. And then Tibet, I don't know if you know this, but Tibet is one of the regions of China that has the highest amount of Communist Manifesto and Mao Zedong like pictures up in all of China, because a lot of Tibetans were slaves, serfs to Tibetan overlords. They were not able to read, and Communist China freed them. And so Tibetans, by and large, absolutely love Communist China. And then Hong Kong, it's hilarious to see the contrast between things like the trucker protests in the Western world, or the or the yellow vest protests in places like France, because they, or Black Lives Matter protests, and uh, uh, any type of protest in the United States, they're far harsher in terms of their response to protesters than China is in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, people were like being like attacked by the protesters, burned alive, etc., etc. And the law enforcement officers were extremely mild in their response. They did everything possible to not be as hostile and aggressive as possible. Like, they did everything to be peaceful, to contain the situation in the mildest way possible. And it's just so amazing to see places like the United States gaslight us about how to handle protest after how the United States handles protest. So China is obviously ready to further enhance its relationship with Russia, because the compatibility between these two countries is just amazing. The resource-rich country of Russia, the manufacturing base of China, some other aspects. So, like, if you see these two countries working together in Central Asia, Russia will be providing security guarantees, and China will be providing economic capital for things like infrastructure investments. And so they really complement each other, not only in terms of their interactions between each other, but also how they interact with the rest of the world. And that allows them to further enhance their strengths so that they can outcompete the United States. So for them, China will go into a country and be like, yeah, we want to economically cooperate with you. And if you need security help, like private military company, here, try Russia's Wagner. And Russia will go in there and help with security and training troops and things like that and training law enforcement for anti-terrorist operations and said, well, yeah, we may not have the economic capital, but I would suggest working with China instead of the United States. And so that's how they do it. They work completely together so that they have their own unique advantages, and they make sure that the United States can't provide security guarantees in there because that's Russia's job, and can't provide economic opportunities because that's China's job. And so they figured out how to be completely complementary while both outcompeting the United States in certain realms. It's really an amazing strategy, and I completely suggested it over a decade ago. So I'm glad they ended up going with it, because that's exactly what I think they should have done, and they didn't. Okay. Mm. Said China saw Japan at the G7 as colluding with the US to bring Europe into the Taiwan issue, a move he likened to waving a red flag in front of a bull. So, this is something I don't understand why places like South Korea, why places like Japan uh, are willing to do things that punish their own economies in order to help the United States. Like Japan with the Plaza Accord, they completely set their economy to not grow at all for decades now because of the Plaza Accords. And South Korea, I recently read that profits down, I believe it was 96% for Samsung, the like major company within South Korea. So why are these countries willing to destroy their own economies to help the United States? I just don't understand it. It doesn't make any sense to me. It has to be extreme amounts of blackmail for them to destroy their own countries like this, because I don't know a single country at this point that's actually benefited from working with the United States. You used to be able to say Japan, and then the Plaza Accords happens, and you used to be able to say, well, Germany after World War II, United States built it up, and it became a major industrial hub. Well, the United States is deindustrializing Germany now, and they attacked German energy infrastructure, and well, they're the most likely culprits behind that. I believe that they certainly did it. And so you're seeing, like, I would love for anyone to just point out what country has actually benefited from the United States. I mean, maybe you could say like a Poland, because Poland gets a lot of resources from the European Union and they've kind of benefited. But I mean, let's look at that in the long term, because Poland might be in some serious trouble, given how close they are to being directly in the Ukrainian conflict themselves. And what happens when other countries that are directly funding Poland, such as Germany, end up declining? Is Poland really going to be successful at that point? Because it's completely dependent on foreign aid. They haven't really been built up in terms of their economic base. Like what is Poland known for producing? Like what goods do they have? Their economy has completely grown because of foreign aid, and so they're completely dependent on the West, and that dependency is going to be their downfall because the United States and the West in general is declining. And so I can't think of a single country that really has, in the medium to long term, benefited from the United States. Some have gotten short term benefits, but not in the long term. Actually, I was watching an interesting series of videos on it called The Weight of Change. You can find on YouTube, about Yugoslavia and how the various countries that made up Yugoslavia, their leaders were co opted by the West, said that your country, your region of Yugoslavia would be better off in the Western sphere of influence, and then they find that it's just a huge debt trap, and these countries are way worse off than they were being a part of the Yugoslavian nation. And so that's really what I wanted to go over here. My main emphasis here was just how mind-boggling it was that this first sentence was allowed to exist. The United States distracted again by a war far from Asia, when Russia, the major country in this war, is majority in Asia. So just mind-boggling that this was allowed to be posted in the New York Times. So just embarrassing. New York Times should be absolutely embarrassed. So if you like this video and want to support the new alternative media, Please actually upvote the video and subscribe to our channel for more content. We're constantly innovating, constantly producing more content. And thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.